Hello students and welcome to this mini lecture on early modern European art. I'm trying to make it somewhat specific so that I don't have to go over all things because much is covered in the supplemental material for this unit. But I did want to specifically look at a few early art movements in the early 1900s. And the way that I want to start thinking about this is actually to think about a broader concept that is modernism. So at this time, at the turn of the century, that is the early 1900s, we have a series of new, what we call isms, right? So this is the thrust of the 20th century. Everything's new, everything's exciting. So speed, motion, change, all of these are kind of coming to the fore at the beginning of the 21st century. Really, really exciting. Make it new. This is the mantra of all the new kind of art movements. And then we see a series of isms succeeding one another. So Cubism is something that we'll talk about right away. Fauvism, we won't talk about German Expressionism, but that is certainly a big part of what's happening here as well. Futurism we'll chat about, Dada, Surrealism and Abstract Expressionism will come later. Pop and Minimalism will come at even later. And then some people talk about what is today as being pluralism, just because artists today are working in such a variety of media and bringing them all together. So that is what, at least when I was in undergrad, I remember and that was a long time ago, my professor saying that, what is today? How will today be remembered? And they brought up this word pluralism, and I have a question mark there because I'm not exactly sure how I feel about it. So let's begin with Cubism. So at the center of this new, really exciting time where everyone's interested in change and innovation was Pablo Picasso. I'm sure many of you have heard of Picasso. If you know anything about art, it's like Da Vinci and Picasso. So you've probably seen this early 1900s painting, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. Picasso was a Spanish artist. This was basically a ground-breaking piece. We'll talk about it in a moment. That's why it's become so important and so popular at the time when it came out right after the turn of the century. From around Europe and America, artists flocked to see this piece, which by 1910 had become a symbol of a modernist break from tradition. So where does this break come from? Well, let's think back to when we talked about photography. Remember how much of a revolution that was for artists? So think about, what is your job if you're an artist before photography? Well, it's probably to try to paint reality to the best of your ability, because you don't have that option yet. Well, when photography is invented, all of a sudden you have the ability of an art form, photography, to actually capture reality, because that is the process of photography. It is one that literally captures a photograph, captures reality onto a page. So at this point in history, right around the turn of the century, remember, photography is invented right in the late 1800s, but really becomes more important and more accessible in the early 1900s. And this might have caused, of course, artists to rethink their role. So if we don't have to adhere to reality anymore, what can we do, right? Well, we can do whatever we want, kind of. And so this is where you have a real kind of shift in the role of the artist, where we see artists beginning to experiment with abstraction, right? Not necessarily realism, even though we still have a real interest in figural figures and objects, but moving away from complete reality. An interest in arbitrary color, right? So things don't have to be the real color that they are. And then from this, we get Cubism, we get nonsense, we get the opposite of the real. And so that will lead us to talk about Dada and later Surrealism. So how does Picasso fare into this? Well, Picasso is known as being kind of the father of Cubism, but it's important to also talk about another artist who worked closely with Picasso and influenced him in many ways, Georges Braque. So Picasso studied in France and was influenced by Georges Braque. You see one of his works here. You maybe even thought it was a Picasso work. When Picasso returned to Paris from Spain in the fall of 1909, he brought with him landscapes that showed just how much Braque had influenced him. So here's one of Braque's works. You see that the designs, it become shapes, right? So if you look closely, of course, you can see it's supposed to be houses and trees. You see the trees, you see the houses. It's still figural, right? But it's abstracted. It's not realistic anymore. All of the real stuff that you see here has been basically turned into its most kind of geometric shapes, triangles, cubes, like you see here. And then of course, this is what Picasso was doing too. And so he's completely and utterly influenced by Braque. And you see him doing a similar kind of thing with his houses on the hill here. Also a landscape, you see the trees, you see the sky, you see the buildings, right? But they're moving away from realism and now much more interested in abstract shapes, geometric forms, right? Basically the basis of reality, you know, based in elementary forms like this. So something that Picasso was really interested in. And this is where we have a movement that we now call Cubism, another one of those isms that comes right at the turn of modernism at the turn of the 1900s. As I've said, art was primarily about form, right? Not reality, but form and elementary forms that everything's made up of. Cubist paintings represented the three-dimensional world in an increasingly two-dimensional space. These are a lot flatter than reality, right? So here you see violin and palette. And this is Braque, if you look to the title, you say, okay, I can find a violin there. Okay, there it is. Here's some sheet music. Here's a palette. You see these things, these real things, but they are, of course, flattened and cubed. So that's where we have Cubism coming from. Now let's talk a little bit more about Picasso and this really important piece. So Picasso obviously is very interested in abstraction, but is still remaining real tied to figures, to the figural. But he's looking to the most elementary forms, shapes, geometry, right? This piece here, Demoiselles d'Avignon, Avignon is a street in France, close to where he was living, and it's a street where you would go and find prostitutes. He frequented this street often, and he wanted to paint the women there. So that's where we have, that's why we have the nude women that you see here. Now, what about these faces? And I'm gonna move myself down to here so you can really see the whole painting. So what about these faces here? Yes, we have an interest in abstraction, obviously, and the face becomes kind of elemental like this because of that. But look to these two specific faces, and also I'd argue to this face as well. For Picasso was very interested in what he would call the primitive art, quote unquote. This was, you know, African masks that he was really interested in, ancient art, art from the Iberian Peninsula, and he was a collector of masks. I think I've got another image here of him in his studio, where he's collected African artifacts, masks, and so forth. There's a young Picasso. And if you look to, this is just cut from this painting, you look to the woman's face here, and you look to a mask in his collection, you see he was really interested in letting this interest in the quote-unquote primitive make its way into his artwork. This is also right at a time when Sigmund Freud, who's a psychoanalyst, is talking about the id and talking about the primitive and the id as being the most kind of quote-unquote primitive or bare part of one's personality. A lot of artists at this time, including Picasso, were really interested in Freud's writings about the primitive. They were interested in looking, you know, obviously in their art, they're looking for ways to get down to the bare essentials of the object, of the person, right? The bare shapes that you see here. And so this interest would also find its way into Freudian writings about kind of the bareness of one's mind and how to access that space. And he felt that he really liked those Freudian writings, and he felt that primitive art would also allow one to access kind of a primitive mindset, which many artists were interested in this time. And now let's move over to the Fauvists. Okay, so if the Cubists were not interested in necessarily in color, you don't see a real emphasis in bringing the color out, right? Of course, here you have vivid colors, but when you compare it to this, we have a whole something completely different. So if the Cubists were more interested in form, the Fauvists would have been interested in color, right? So what were they? So this is of course coming. Oh no, this. I'm sorry. This is. I don't know why. Don't show me again. Oh. All right. Sorry about that. I had some weird thing that came up on the screen. The Fauvists are really interested in expressive qualities of color, right? Arbitrary color. Not form at all. And, people at the time hated this. They thought it was horrifying. They were appalled by it. And in fact, here you see a piece by Henri Matisse, a Frenchman working in 1905 and right around the turn of the century. And people would call these people beasts. And in fact, that's where the name comes from. So fauve, this is they actually, the artists who were part of this movement read a review of their works in a local newspaper, and the woman who had written it called them wild beasts, fauves. And so they said, yeah, we like that. And so they started naming themselves the Fauves, and the movement is now Fauvism. So they liked that, and they wanted to be known as being a little bit wild. It caused a huge uproar. People would say, I can't believe this woman is being painted with a green face. Her face is not green. She looks sick. What's wrong with her? When in fact, that was exactly what these artists wanted to do. They wanted to push the boundaries of color. And that's what we have happening at this time in history, where you really have artists moving against the grain, moving against tradition for very specific reasons. I also want to talk about Futurism. This is another movement that pops up here in Italy right around the turn of the century. So in 1909, Italian Filippo Marinetti published a manifesto, as many of these art movement the starters of these movements do, announcing futurism, the coming of futurism. They emphasized speed, technology, youth, violence, objects such as cars, airplanes, the industrial city, right? Movement. These are the futurists. They're interested in moving forward to the future. They were interested in the spirit of the machine, rapid change, all these things that seem to be defining the turn of the century. Now, I want you to think about these just for a second. Now, I'm talking about this movement, Futurism, and these are Italians. And so when you think of Italian art, hopefully this is what comes up for you. These are pretty famous, and obviously you might not know them. I totally get that. I'm sure you've seen the Mona Lisa. Pictured here by Da Vinci. Here's a Botticelli Venus, and here we have Michelangelo's David. These are very important Italian Renaissance pieces. The Italian Renaissance was a really important time in the history of art, where artists were kind of at their peak after the quote-unquote Dark Ages, where artists were looking back to classical art, but also innovating in a variety of ways. And this is what people think of when they think of Italian art. And so these artists, the futurists, were saying, no, 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 that's our past. That happened in 1500, around the 14 and 1500s. We are living here now at the turn of the century. We are the futurists. We're moving forward, not back towards that. So they wanted to move away from that and towards something new. They're saying, we don't do that anymore. Everyone thinks that that's what we do because we're Italians. No, we're moving, we're with you. We're in the present, we're in the future. So here you have a real fascination with moving forward and movement itself. So here you have Giacomo Balla, who's an artist working in 1912 here, dynamism of dog on a leash. So literally capturing movement by, of course, giving the woman 20 feet, right? And giving the dog a variety of feet, just to imply movement. Even the leash is depicted 4 different times. So it demonstrates its debt to new technological media, in particular photography, because by this time in history, there was a real interest in using photography to capture movement. And of course, this is where we have the moving image, so this leads to film as well. Just another futurist work for you, Umberto Boscione. Here you have, of course, the unique forms of continuity in space, a real interest again in space and movement through space, gives a sense of the figure striding forward. These are the futurists, the clothing flaps behind him, this type of thing. I do want to mention quickly the Armory Show. So this was an international exhibition of modern art that was held in New York in 1913. It was called the Armory Show. It was at an armory in New York. And this was the first time that basically European artists were shown in New York. And so American artists were like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. This is amazing. Look at all this new innovative stuff that's happening in Western Europe. And so we'll talk more about Americans at a later time, but this is something that it's important that happens in 1913 as European artists begin to influence American artists. So it was the first exhibition of European art in America. Americans were accustomed to realistic art. And so here we had an emphasis on abstraction. So they were introduced to Fauvism, Cubism, Futurism, Dada, and Surrealism. Really an important show. So that brings